Everyone, come on into our shared space, gather round. Thank you for being here, for separating from whatever had you gripped before 7 p.m. Eastern time. And if you wish, why don't we just mark joining the space with a deep breath in for 5 counts, holding it for 4, and pushing out the air for 7 counts, or until you can't push anymore. And now we'll just return to gentle breathing, regular breathing. Hello, my name is Alison Gardy, and I am a class of 1988 and a board member of Yale Alumni Educators, a community of teachers and students committed to unleashing human potential, developing critical thinking, fostering responsibility for one another, and perhaps most important, finding laughter and solace in each other's company. Tonight, Yale Alumni Educators launches Learning in the Age of Climate Change, a series of conversations about climate education designed to help us learn and teach in fast-changing times. Our first conversation, Turning Anxiety into Action, is tonight, featuring Anya Kamenetz, class of 2002, and Naina Agrawal-Hardin, class of 2025. They work with families and school communities to address climate change. Though more than 20 years separate them, both have had life experiences that brought them to this point tonight. We want you to leave tonight's conversation with lots of goodies to support and sustain you as you work to ignite young people's agency in the face of climate change. Some of you wrote us and asked if we'd be addressing the concerns of teachers of younger students, such as kindergartners. So Lara Dominguez and other kindergarten teachers on this call, yes, we shall. I'm going to share a bit about our panelists, Anya and Naina. While I do, all 3 of us would appreciate it if you would put in the chat something you want us to know about you. That will help us know who's in the room and what to discuss. Feel free to use the question and answer for your questions, and we may take some questions as we go along, and certainly in the last part of the conversation. Now to introduce our panelists. Anya Kamenetz has covered education as both a journalist and author of several books, including The Stolen Year, How COVID Changed Children's Lives and Where We Go Now, The Art of Screen Time, How Your Family Can Balance Digital Media and Real Life, and she reads that aloud herself on audiobooks, and DIYU, which I have here, Edupunks, Edupreneurs, and the Coming Transformation of Higher Education, among other books. Anya is an advisor to the Aspen Institute and the Climate Mental Health Network, focusing on issues involving children and climate change and multi-generational approaches. Her Substack is thegoldenhour.substack.com. Naina Agrawal-Hardin is a rising junior at Yale and a climate justice organizer who's mobilized middle school and high school students through the Sunrise Movement to help coordinate climate strikes locally and nationwide. She has served on the Aspen Institute's K-12 Climate Action Commission, and you will find her words and ideas published in the New York Times, Teen Vogue, USA Today, the Hechinger Report, and other publications. To start, I'd like to note that the 3 of us embrace 4 decades of Yale women. To show you how far we've come with regard to acknowledging the reality of human-induced climate change, I'll share a brief story about a conversation I had when I was 10 years older than Naina and about 15 years younger than Anya. I was at a convening of New Jersey public school principals as an observer and writer. In casual conversation, the subject of fossil fuels came up, and I advocated for solar energy. I was laughed at, silenced, and even called, quote, a bleeding heart, close quote. Alas, Greta Thunberg had not yet been born. And here we are tonight, in a world in which, for the most part, the veil has been ripped off the why of climate change, yet we still very much struggle with the how to address it, especially with young children who are the next generation of caretakers of our planet and have no choice but to do better than we have. Naina, Anya, can you help us learn to talk with our children, our students? And we know the answer to that. You have ideas. And let's start first by learning about you and your childhoods and how you got here tonight. Anya?
Thank you so much for that introduction, Alison, and thank you for your generosity and effort in putting this important conversation together. I really hope that everyone who's on the call and everyone who watches this leaves with a sense of motivation and hope and some concrete action steps that they can take to be part of the change that we need, because I think education is so crucially important to the climate evolution that we need. So my presence here was a little bit preordained by the fact, the fact that I was born in South Louisiana. I was brought up in South Louisiana. My parents both moved to Baton Rouge to take jobs at Louisiana State University when I was about a year old. And so I grew up with the threat of hurricanes, very intense storms. I attended a Cancer Alley protest that was aimed at the petrochemical plants that have become one of the most notorious symbols of environmental racism in the country as a young girl. And so growing up, always very aware of the threats, also really just loving nature, loving the very special nature of the swamplands and the Gulf South and the bayous there, and just the abundance of the subtropical life there. And so growing up, specialized in education reporting, but my climate awareness just continued to grow. My parents eventually relocated to New Orleans, and they were there during Katrina. I was there right after Katrina as a volunteer and as a reporter. And, that really started me, I think, early on the path that I'm on today.
Thank you so much, Anya. And Naina, we're going to juxtapose your journey. Very different.
Yeah. So I grew up in Ann Arbor, Michigan, which is often dubbed the best educated city in America. And I was, in public schools from kindergarten through 12th grade and really loved each of them. But that educational context was really different than the contexts in both of the towns where my parents grew up. So my mom's parents are based in rural Appalachia, East Tennessee, and the kids that I knew in that region had to take buses, for upwards of an hour to get to schools that were crumbling infrastructurally and really under-resourced. And anytime there was any severe weather, those bus routes wouldn't work and they just wouldn't be able to get to school. And then it was actually a really similar situation in my dad's hometown in rural northern India, where, all of my cousins who grew up there had to leave home at really young ages in a similar way that my dad had to when he was young, because there just weren't schools that were, capable of giving a quality education anywhere near where their parents lived. And those schools that my cousins attended and the schools in our hometown were also really susceptible to monsoon cycles and extreme weather, extreme heat. And so, these were really different educational contexts, but one thing that they all had in common is none of them were actually talking about climate change in the classroom. None of them were, providing students with a holistic environmental education of any kind. And so seeing extreme weather, both in Michigan and in my parents' hometowns growing up, made me it inspired a lot of cognitive dissonance for me, because I was like, clearly climate change is an issue, but we're not talking about it at school. So as Alison mentioned, when I was in high school, I started working with the Sunrise Movement and other youth climate organizations to basically almost create alternative educational environments for middle and high schoolers who wanted to do something about climate change, wanted to learn about the issue and the solutions, but weren't getting that in the classroom. So I helped run trainings programs for adolescents, and it was a really wonderful experience that I'm happy to answer questions about. And I still work a lot with middle and high schoolers who have those interests today.
And Naina, could you just also tell us a little bit about what you're going to be doing this summer?
Yeah, absolutely. So actually in about 3 days, I'm going to leave Ann Arbor, which is where I'm calling in from tonight, and go to Southern Illinois to a summer camp that has graciously allowed the Sunrise Movement to rent out their facilities. And we're going to be running a 2-week or 2-week-long summer camp sessions for middle and high schoolers who want to organize for climate justice specifically within the context of their schools. So the program is called Green New Deal for Schools, and the camp is called Sunrise Summer Camp. We're going to be working with about 160 kids from over 50 school districts across the United States who want to learn basically what can I do about climate change at school? How can I target my school board? How can I work with my teachers and administrators to bring these issues into my education in a productive way?
Thank you, Naina. And I'll add that camp is free to participants, right? Yeah. Great. Well, we've already, thank you for sharing your journeys. And we've already got some excitement brewing in the Q&A and the chat. Thank you everyone for being resourceful and going to Q&A when our chat was stalled. We've got links from Anya from Sunrise Summer Camp and lots of interesting people in the room with us. One question I think is a good guiding one for the beginning of our conversation. Mike Fishback, who's also happens to be a board member of Yale Alumni Educators, writes that he conducts Model United Nations with his middle school students. And they try to create policy about climate change and confront the reality of global politics. So big question, how can we educate about the reality of why progress is often so slow without really deterring and dampening children's hope?
Yeah, I mean, I'd be interested to hear what Naina thinks from the student perspective, but I would sort of challenge him to flip that question a little bit, because if you say the reality is that progress is slow, you're kind of taking for granted the status quo. And I think the thing that's been so energizing about the climate movement in the last several years, you mentioned Greta Thunberg, is people coming on board and saying, actually, it's not okay that this is so slow. That the pace is not keeping pace with physics and with reality. And so we might be at a paradigm shift. And what I would challenge teachers to look at is similar moments in history when social movements reached tipping points and a supernova of change occurred. Now, my feeling is that in the US education system, we spend a lot of time looking at structures of power, but not necessarily at social movements or people power with the same lens or the same seriousness. And so when you look at something like the Montgomery bus boycott, like, yes, it took years. It did take very many years of work. But then again, things got to a head where there was a short period of months where things happened very fast. And so, it's worth kind of taking that as a question and an opener for discussion rather than a given that change is always slow. That would be my challenge.
Yeah, oh, sorry, Alison. I was just going to say, I completely agree with Anya. And actually, one of the only things that's served as really strong motivation and a really strong source of hope for me has been looking back at these examples of sort of past societal tipping points and moments where the so-called reality shifted, political reality or general reality. And I actually study history at Yale on the social change and social movements pathway because of how inspiring I found those kinds of stories when I was a high schooler. So yeah, I think in the context of Model United Nations, maybe this is looking at really important past treaties or past agreements and thinking about how did negotiators come to these agreements, but also what was happening in society more broadly that catalyzed these kinds of conversations, and how can we replicate that in our current moment to address the climate crisis?
Thank you both. The questions are rolling in. Claire Steichen talks about a game she created, Energetic, that teaches kids and adults about the systems that impact climate, and asks the question, how can we and our kids figure out how to put pressure on beyond just our vote?
I'll give that to you since you're the organizer.
To me. No, to Naina.
Naina, yeah.
Yeah, I was actually just going to say in the chat that I saw Mike talk about the Overton window, and I really love that concept, and I think it's really an awesome concept to connect to the climate crisis. But yeah, moving on to
that. Tell us about the Overton window for those who don't know.
Yeah, honestly, Mike might be able to explain it better than I can because it's been a while since I brushed up on my movement theory, but it's kind of the idea of what's the range of political solutions that society deems kind of acceptable, or that society is used to hearing about, or that society sees as possible. And it can change at a given time, so like the Overton window on climate is kind of different in Europe than it is in the US, because people just have a different notion of what's possible to accomplish in society. And social movements often are the best ways of shifting that window in one direction or the other. As for pressure beyond just voting, and I'm so glad that we're talking about solutions beyond just voting, because so often that's the rhetoric we get from our national political leaders. And for those of us who, became active in these spheres when we were under 18, it was so frustrating. It was like, we're ready to take action, but we can't vote. Like, what else is there? So thank you for asking about that. I think one sort of technique that we used in the Sunrise Movement trainings that I helped design was to talk like this thing called power mapping, which many people may be familiar with. It's kind of a way of laying out, okay, who are the decision makers at, within my school district, within my city government, within my state legislature, within my country, or even internationally. And then how do we make them move? Like, what are they motivated by? Which administrator has the power to do what? Like this really granular analysis of basically where does the power lie and what does it respond to? And, oftentimes when you actually go through that exercise, you find that, some decision makers respond to votes, but even those elected decision makers also respond to where their campaign financing comes from, or how they look on the news when activists confront them, or, these other things that really are much more accessible to students. So I recommend, there's a lot of great resources online, and I can try to find some to put in the chat, great worksheets and sort of like prompt questions that you can use to start thinking about power structures in that kind of mapping way.
Thanks so much, Naina. And now another question for both of you from Alyssa Levy, who is also founding board member of Yale Alumni Educators and runs our summer picnic program, by the way, for educators who want to get outdoors around the world. In August, there will be picnics around the world. And Alyssa asks, what climate-related books have been most influential for you, and who are the climate influencers you follow on social media?
Yeah, I have to do some fast Googling so I can put links in the chat. I really recommend the memoir Warmth by Daniel Sherrill. It's a beautifully written and just very honest account of what it feels like to be a millennial in this moment. There is a great book that is for tweens by Leslie Davenport called All the Feelings Under the Sun. That is a great way to, I think it could be a springboard to a lot of different lessons for teachers that gets to the sort of emotional climate emotion reality. There's a book that I worked on by Margaret Klein Solomon, which is really about kind of panicking and then taking action. It's sort of a self-help book for the end of the world. And that is one that I really recommend checking out as well. And I'll put the links in the chat.
Yeah, I love this question. I would say anything by Mary Anais Helger, who's been like an amazing mentor to me, and also a really great voice of a woman of color. She's a Black woman from New Orleans, actually. She writes about climate grief and climate anxiety and then how to transform those feelings into action. So she's wonderful. And I have several friends who contributed to All We Can Save, which is, some folks may have heard of that book. I think it does a good job of bringing in an intergenerational perspective and of talking about solutions to the climate crisis. So I recommend that one to anyone who hasn't read it.
This is wonderful, really, really enriching. I have a question that comes from just what I'm hearing around the schools, and, you know, this sense that children are not quite sure how to manage their own feelings about this, and that affects how effective they feel as actors. And we can say, well, all of us have to do our little bit, and yet we know we need to do some heavy lifting. So what do you say to a child who just feels that their little bit is just not going to go a very long way?
So this is something that I focus on a lot with my work with the Climate Mental Health Network. And we actually have created a first round of resources meant for parents, but also can be used by teachers to talk about climate emotions. I think it's really, really important. And I want to observe, even in the setting that we have right now, there's a great urgency often to rush toward solutions and then to start arguing about tactics. And I feel like that's a way of bypassing the enormity of, in fact, what we're all going through. And we're going to need a lot of different kinds of skills to get through the climate crisis. I mean, this is not something that honestly we're going to solve or resolve, I don't believe, in my lifetime. I think we're going to be grappling with it for generations. And so a big part of how we do that is we grow socially, emotionally, in our communities, in the ways that we support and show up for each other. And so I think a lot of what teachers have a rich amount of resources. And I've seen, as someone who's covered and been in classrooms for 2 decades, a growing awareness of the importance of building social and emotional resilience within the classroom, shifting from talking about discipline and behavior to talking about restorative justice and how we strengthen relationships and trust to create real safety within schools. Understanding that when a child is acting out in the classroom, that you don't ask, what's wrong with you? You ask, what happened to you? And just teachers building their capacity. And I think this is so important in the climate crisis. Learning how to make room for those feelings. And it might be in the middle of a science class or a civics lesson, or preparing for a presentation that someone stops and acknowledges, yes, this is hard. Yes, this hurts. And we're really in the fight of our lives here. It's so healing just to be able to say that.
So there's comfort. Many adults fear acknowledging the problem because it seems so weighty, so heavy, so insurmountable, so much a recipe for added depression. But it sounds, if I'm understanding you well, that you're saying just the acknowledgement of how serious it is and all of our feelings around that is a kind of relief.
I think it's huge. I think knowing that you're not alone is really the first step. And breaking that silence, breaking that pluralistic ignorance can be really motivating to act. There's also obviously ways in which we need to be able to cope with the emotions themselves so that we don't get overwhelmed, and also to find joy and relief, so that we're not, it's not up to any one of us or any one of our students to fix this by themselves, and they should not feel that obligation. So, besides the urgency, there also has to be room for rest and room for them to pursue other things that they love to do.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with this. And in many ways, what was most valuable for me about entering into social movement spaces, climate movement spaces, was the community that it came with. It was empowering just to take action. But what was even more important for me, I think, was the fact that I wasn't alone in being worried about this problem. And I wish that could have come within the context of my school. I really had to seek it out because it was a taboo to talk about in the classroom. And there's a reason that when we ran trainings programs and for the summer camp that we're running, like we don't invite lone students from their schools. Students, in order to qualify, they have to come with either one or two or maybe even three or four friends from their school who they can go back with and organize with, because it is heavy. It's really hard to deal with alone, especially when you're young. And I know a lot of young people who do really struggle with climate anxiety and climate grief if they don't have access to community to process that with. So, but I think where adults have trouble is they think that bringing it up at all is the source of that anxiety and grief, when in reality, dealing with it alone is what makes it insurmountable and really challenging, which is why it's such a good thing to talk about in schools, is because that is your community. And those are the people you talk to when you walk home at the end of the day or on the school bus at the end of the day. Like that is a built-in collective processing space that we don't take enough advantage of in these conversations.
So not to thread a needle here, but it sounds as if you're both defining a difference between accepting that progress is slow. And we have a couple of comments, at least in the chat, to that point, and acknowledging that it's hard, as Carter Brooks wrote in the chat. It's hard, and it will be hard. Is there a difference?
I mean, it might be the same people at different times of day, like there's, I think we have to push with all our might, and then we have to rest, because part of our might comes from the rest and comes from understanding that we can't do it alone. It is, I think, especially in the United States, maybe in Western philosophy, there's a tendency to very black or white thinking or all or nothing thinking. And I've really taken a lot from a little bit more non-dualistic modes of thinking, and realizing, well, emotions come and go, our flow, our energy comes and goes. The goal continues to be the goal, and we move towards it as much as we can. And sometimes we have to rest because we can't do it alone.
Yeah, I mean, there's a wonderful adage that we use a lot in movement spaces that's sort of like, you're a choir, not a soloist. It has to be that if one person stops singing, the sound stays the same. And I've always loved that, because I also do like a cappella at Yale. So it's a very apt metaphor for me. But I think it's really true, and it's a good one to use with students as well, so that people take a little bit of pressure off themselves. You're not on that stage alone, and and it's okay to take a break, go on vocal rest for a couple weeks, a couple months, even a couple years.
And Naina, when you mentioned that in your high school, you felt it was taboo to talk about fear around climate reality in the classroom or climate change, that you had to seek it out elsewhere. But were you able to change the dialogue in your high school, or was it not the right time, not the right place for people?
That's a great question. So I say it's taboo because I have memories of, like, I had this awesome chemistry teacher, Miss Wagner. She was the best. And I remember one day in class, like, we were chatting, and someone asked her, like, Miss Wagner, do you believe in climate change? Kind of like to be a provocateur. And she didn't feel comfortable saying, yes, I do. She obviously insinuated it very heavily. She was very like hip with the kids. And she was like, oh, what do you think? And so we all knew she did, but she didn't feel like she could say that out loud in the classroom. And I was like, wow, that's amazing. Like, this is a science teacher who doesn't feel like she can say, I believe climate change is real. And at the same time, like, we had an environmental club at school, which was led by another amazing teacher, Mr. Fox, who would he would be in the lunchroom every day with the compost bins, like walking around to all the tables and asking for food scraps and talking about the importance of reducing our methane emissions. And so I was kind of in a both and high school. And I think that question in some ways is better asked of like some of my peers who've done this work in the Deep South and are dealing with like actual serious climate denial in their schools, because the understanding was there in my school. It just wasn't talked about. So I guess yes and no is the answer. And I think, I would be happy to put some links in the chat of like testimonies from students who've done this work in schools where there is real climate denial and like censorship in the classroom. But yeah, exactly. Educators are hyper aware of the potential consequences of talking about these issues in the classroom. And also, like, when your educator is afraid to talk about this because it seems too controversial, that also sends a message to students that they shouldn't talk about it because it's too controversial, which is, just contributes to all of that siloing and, solo processing that we were mentioning earlier. So yeah, I know that's not quite an answer to your question. I just don't want to misrepresent the situation I was dealing with in high school. But yeah.
No, that's really helpful because you're touching on that nuance that keeps so many people from having real conversations, that that hesitancy that we never put words to because it's loaded, and there's a suggestion that somehow this will not lead to something productive and positive. And so is there a pathway through the polarization, through the politicization? Is there a path we can hack through all of that to just talk in a way that is local, direct, authentic, meaningful to everyone involved, whether it's about cleaning up the river that runs through town or...
I can speak to this. This is getting a jump on a story that I have coming out, so no one tell anyone. But I was in a classroom in a high school in the Central Valley, California, which is a surprisingly conservative place. And this classroom has a career technical education program, the high school, where the student's job is to maintain and to expand the decarbonization of the school through tracking the energy performance of the schools. They have an energy competition where one school competes against another to use less energy. They are dealing with better forms of transportation, trying to get more students to be safe walking and biking to school. So they're just working on the problem from all angles. And two different students mentioned to me that their parents were indifferent or hostile to climate politics. One was kind of an all-out denier, kind of Trump direction. The other one was a working class Hispanic immigrant who just was like, I don't relate to progressive, quote unquote, progressive politicians and all the solutions that they come in with. So I'm not interested in climate change as an issue. But the program pays minimum wage, $15.50 an hour in California. And that was reason enough for their kids to participate. And through their kids' participation, both families moved on the issue. They didn't do 180, but they moved on the issue. And so there's these ripple effects going on throughout the community. As these students are getting out there, they're making real changes in their community. They're making their community more walkable, safer, saving money for the school that the school can use on other things. And these very practical steps, which are powerful, are giving the students hope and motivation, and they're also changing attitudes in the older generation.
Naina, do you want to add anything to that? Thank you, Anya.
Yeah, I mean, I would say I think locally based and case-based education is a really great entry point for schools that have the flexibility and the resources to do that. At my school, we had a really modest garden out back that students could opt into helping to maintain. And then along with that came some education about sustainable agriculture and, the importance of sourcing your food locally. We actually also had a donor. This was very unusual for my high school, but we had a donor who gave money. And I should add, my high school is about 10 years old. It's a public school where all of the students qualify for free and reduced lunch. We were not a wealthy school, but a donor gave enough money for us to have solar panels on our school building. And then our environmental science class, which was a pretty small group, but there were a few students who opted into that, they could actually do projects analyzing the energy flow through the solar panels, which was like an amazing opportunity. And actually, when I was going into my junior year of high school, we moved buildings, and unfortunately we had to leave the solar panels behind, which was a real shame. But I think one thing that we talked about a lot on the Aspen Institute Commission was how can we actually make school buildings themselves sites of locally based environmental and climate education. It doesn't even have, it's great if it can be out in the community, but even just on the school grounds themselves, how can we really tangibly create like educational and, opportunities for students who are interested in these issues. And there's a lot of ways to do that. Not all of them are as expensive as having solar panels on the roof. But I think it's a really interesting idea.
Having solar panels on the roof is not expensive. There is the Inflation Reduction Act. There are refundable tax credits that there's new guidance on that schools can actually get money upfront very quickly. And of course, they're going to pay for it themselves over time. So that's not called expensive.
Yeah. And I wish the IRA had been around when I was in high school. Like that would have been awesome,
Totally.
And tell us what that stands for, the IRA.
Sorry, Inflation Reduction Act. That's
The largest investment in clean energy in our history. If these investments become facts on the ground, we're projecting 40% reduction in the US carbon emissions. And schools as publicly owned buildings are a major place where these investments can go into action. They need, right now, it's not as straightforward as it should be to take advantage of these credits and these special incentives, but it's getting easier all the time. And so in my Aspen Institute world, this is a huge part of the focus. It's just making sure schools understand how they can get the money and why they should be using it.
That's amazing. Anya, do you happen to have a link for that to put into the chat? Thank you.
Yeah.
And speaking of what schools can do, solar panels, not as expensive as you think. Perhaps that reflecting white paint might help as well. That's and then John McLaughlin asks in our chat, Yale 88, hello, John. Schools that are incorporating urban agriculture effectively into their curricula and community relations. And he talks about Arlington, Virginia, which has made some strides. Any stories about urban gardens or others?
Yeah, I'm seeing this everywhere. I saw recently in the South Bronx with a roof garden that the students built during COVID when they needed an outdoor classroom space. In this same school in Porterville in Central Valley, California, the schools actually were originally built with on-site agricultural facilities. So they have a swine, they have pigs, they have chickens, and they have an orange orchard that's been around for like 50 years. So that's pretty amazing. So it's interesting to think about the school gardens movement because it has been something that's popped up and kind of grown alongside traditional education. And it's made inroads sort of in our consciousness without there ever being, there's some federal action. I mean, Michelle Obama was a big advocate for school gardens, but it really has grown as a cultural movement and an important way, I think, for students to experience nature. And I think that's only going to grow.
Question about the reality of advocating for change when there are just political realities that are forcing compromise in powerful ways. A few people have put in the chat references to the pipeline and what do we do with all those feelings around that? What do we do with all those realities? And I'll throw into the mix, a few years ago, I spoke with a diplomat, I won't name the country, but a country that's highly forested in East Asia, and basically said, you had your turn. You had your turn. Look at your society. Look at your economy. It's our turn now. Don't tell us not to cut down our forest. Easy for you to say. Anya, I saw you took yourself off mute. Good.
Oh, are you sure? Okay. I mean, these are two really different questions, right? The first question is about urgency. And the fact is that things are going on that are unacceptable. And it's important to name that and acknowledge that. The person in the chat who said, my daughter's really upset about Joe Biden and the Mountain Valley Pipeline. Good. Make a video, talk about it, tell your friends, don't shut up. Like, this is important. And if you get to that point, I mean, I think some really important work has been done to physically stop the installation of things like, fossil fuel installations across the country, both legal action and direct action, and they really work hand in hand. this is a great example of the Overton window. I mean, when you have a set of people who are willing to go and get arrested, it makes the people who are fighting in court seem a lot more moderate. So that's important. Everyone is needed. This is multiplicity of tactics kind of idea. The second question is a lot harder to be flip about. We're all sitting in relatively comfortable, I would guess, in air-conditioned and electrified homes, where the heat waves and the weather are not touching us, and that's not true around the world. So climate justice is really, really important. The concept of loss and damage, which is in the international climate negotiations, somewhat akin to the idea of reparations. How do we actually give developing nations the resources that they need to develop for human health and flourishing without killing the planet? It's going to require a massive transfer of resources. And I don't think there's any analysis of climate action that is complete without acknowledging these questions about the concentration of wealth, about colonialism, about historical structures of power that have created the situation that we're in.
Yep. Couldn't agree more. So for the first, I agree, this is sort of two distinct issues, both of which are really important. For the first, I would just reiterate what we touched on earlier, which is teaching young people about moments in history when change has come from the grassroots instead of from the top down, because most of the political education you get as a young person is, this is who makes the decisions in the country: the president, Supreme Court, kind of Congress, and that's it. And that's like really disempowering, because then if the president is approving a pipeline that people fought really hard to stop, it's like, well, you know, that's who's in power. And it makes you feel really small. And so I think highlighting these examples of times, you know, one thing we learned about in Sunrise political education, not in school, wish we'd learned about it in school, was how much the New Deal coalition, this grassroots coalition of labor and environmental and you know, occasionally faith-based and race-based affinity groups actually pushed FDR to Franklin Delano Roosevelt to institute New Deal era reforms. We're often told this top-down story, not just about the New Deal, but about pretty much every major historical moment. Well, this is how it happened. This singular decision maker, you know, finally decided, let's do something about this problem. And then we had the New Deal, or we had the Civil Rights Act. And I think flipping that script and teaching students, well, actually, there was all this pressure from hundreds or thousands or millions of people for years before that happened, is a really great way to help people keep the faith when these top-down decisions are not turning out the way we want them to. And then, yeah, I'm really passionate about that historical distinction as a history major. And then for the second, really passionate about that too, coming from India and being exposed to a lot of those arguments from family members, and also seeing, like, yeah, there's just a lot more resources where my parents raised me than where my dad was raised, and that's not fair. And it is a direct result of colonialism. And I've written actually like papers about this at Yale, because it's one of the thorniest arguments for climate activists to kind of work their way around. And I think Anya's absolutely right. It's going to require a massive, basically, transfer of capital in a really reparations framework kind of way. And you know, that also calls into question a lot of difficult truths about, like, our economic system and why that is so hard to achieve, why that's so far outside of our current Overton window if we want to keep using that framework, and what it would take to change that. So yeah, and I think loss and damage is a really good start, and I'm really excited to see what happens with that at international negotiations moving forward.
So this is kind of tricky. I mean, once again, getting back a little bit to threading the needle, you know, I'm hearing the message, right? Get out there, make a difference, do what you can, make a video, state your opinion, state your disappointment. Every bit matters in a perhaps butterfly effect of letting your voice be heard and how that unleashes other voices. And yet we're at such a delicate time in our history. And just to play devil's advocate for a moment, you know, if we think about where we are as sort of trying to keep the boat of democracy afloat in many ways, I'm going to refer to Carter Brooks in the chat here saying, you know, can we encourage holding paradox, giving credit at the same time as being upset rather than throwing it all out the window by being an absolutist? So what does it mean to push this conversation forward and to protect our planet and change our culture in order to do so?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a great question for educators. It's a great question for, you know, it makes me grateful that we have educators and concerned educators like the ones on this call, because the place for complexity and the place for these arguments is in the classroom. You know, we deserve to take that time to think through those positions and have critical thinking and have analysis. And I don't think that's separate in any way from being motivated to take action. I think that it is a necessary, just as we have necessary time for joy, for community building, for self-care, we have necessary time for research and analysis and debate, and there's necessary time for action. So I take an Ecclesiastes kind of approach where, you know, there's a time for everything and a season for all of it. And we can't be forced into, you know, urgency. Oftentimes, you know, it has been in the powerful system, the system of power that we're in creates urgency, and it takes people's time. It takes people's capacity to, you know, make their own decisions, because you have to either make money, you have to meet someone else's deadline. And that's kind of the way of thinking that got us to the disaster that we're in. And so insisting on time for rest, you know, people noticed this during the pandemic, that actually you can work from home, and actually maybe you could work a little bit less. And that also reduces carbon emissions. So how can we insist on time to think about things and insist on time to think about complexity, and make that part of our practice and not opposite to it?
Yeah, and just to add on, I see Carolyn in the chat talking about this really pervasive sense that we don't have time to address the roots of the climate crisis. And that's also such a product of urgency in the way it exists culturally right now. And I think, yeah, one framework that's been really helpful to me is like, yes, climate change is a really urgent and scary and dangerous crisis. And then also it is an opportunity to build pretty much every societal structure better than it exists right now. And that's like really exciting. And that's kind of what, you know, the Green New Deal for schools is all about. It's like there's a lot that we wish we could change about our schools. You know, whether it's like disparities in funding across districts, or whether it's how healthy the school lunch is, or whether it's, you know, whether there's any toxic chemicals in the infrastructure. Like there's just a ton of issues that can be addressed and should be addressed when we think about climate solutions in schools. And so, yeah, I think, but those kinds of conversations can only happen if you take a step back and think, how do we do it right? Like if we have to kind of take everything down and build it back up, that's going to take some time, and it's going to take a lot of collaborative thought and working in coalition, which is very time consuming. But if that's what it takes to do it right, then that's what we're going to do. And that inspires a lot more hope and brings a lot more stakeholders in than just kind of a Band-Aid over a bullet hole solution that's only about emissions or only about green infrastructure.
Thank you both. One of our participants tonight, going back to Alyssa Levy, pointed out, you know, we seem to have a lot of climate educators in our room tonight, and people who are knowledgeable and also sharing in the chat, working on different initiatives. So Naina and Anya, do you have suggestions for us or ideas of ways we can come together in the work that we're doing? I
feel like there's different kinds of groups. I mean, Subject to Climate is an interesting site where teachers are sharing and creating resources and lessons plans, which is interesting. I don't know, and please, people in the chat, correct me, I don't know of national groups that are focusing on organizing educators as a group. I know that there are, there's, for example, Third Act, which is Bill McKibben's generational group. They have an educators working group within that group. So it's current and retired educators who are over 60. So they're kind of organizing into affinity groups. And then in different districts where there's this significant amount of climate action, we're seeing a lot of teachers step in and help. I totally agree, Carolyn. I think you're just the person to start it, actually.
I would only add that I saw a comment earlier about how we keep this from being just one more thing on educators' plates when educators are already so overburdened and undervalued. And I don't have a great solution for that. I haven't ever been an educator myself, but I do just want to give a nod to that comment because I think it's such a real concern. And yeah, I mean, resource sharing, like, is something I watched my educators do my whole life. My Spanish teacher would have the most amazing worksheets and we'd be like, did you make this? And she'd be like, no, my favorite Spanish teacher blog posted it and I printed it out this morning and it took me 5 minutes. And like, if we could get to a place like that on climate, it would be amazing.
I think it's a great question, Maureen. I'm glad you called it back, Naina. I do think that I've had some success in introducing the idea that climate is a lens, not a topic. And we can definitely see this in New Jersey, where they have instituted climate across every grade and every subject, right? So this is the idea that it shouldn't be just the provenance of middle school science teachers, which is where it mostly pops up in the curriculum. And it shouldn't just be something that you cover, kind of at the end of the year when you're done with, everything else. So thinking about ways that this intersects with anything else that you might want to teach, whether it is art, whether it is the readings that you assign, the topics you assign, if students are giving, giving speeches or making reports, things you learn about your environment that your school is in, political ideas, anything that you allow to have student choice and let them bring it in and just be aware and help them with the resources. So there's lots of little incremental little steps, citizen journalism projects that students can get involved with, field science, research, and then all of this stuff around the school operations. I mean, I'm super excited. I love that you had a compost maven at your school. I too had a teacher like that, Ira Nierenberg. He was my AP physics teacher and the advisor of the Green Society in my high school. And he was the one who, was our advocate when we wanted to find trees to give away or, figure out ways to promote vegetarianism. And so there's a lot of different ways to weave it into the topics that you're already teaching or elicit the student interest and let it be student driven and just build on that fire. And so in those ways, hopefully it doesn't feel like yet one more thing that you're responsible for, because I'm very, very aware that teachers feel overburdened.
Thank you. We also had composting in my public elementary school here in New York City where my children were, but it was run by parents and it was run by even then who became parent alumni and just required a whole team of volunteers with passports that made people competitive about how much compost they were bringing in and how often, but fragile in that it really depended on parent and parent alumni volunteers sustaining it. Naina, did you want to also reply to that?
Yeah, I was just going to add some very small ways that professionals in my schools were able to help me without overhauling their lesson plans or, altering their curriculum. And like when I was in 6th grade, before I had sort of parsed out systemic versus individual action in my head, I used to go around my school cafeteria and pick plastic bottles out of the trash with my hands and put them in the recycling because I was just like, it's so lame that we have recycling here and my peers don't recycle their bottles, and I wanted to basically make a point of it. And as you can imagine, that made me super popular in my middle school cafeteria, and the lunch ladies, after a few months of this, just started offering me plastic gloves. And like that was an amazing gesture from them of support, and also thank God, because that was way more sanitary. And it was a really small thing, but it helped a lot. Similarly, in high school, when I was organizing climate strikes, like there were some teachers who, they taught math or they taught, physics, but they were willing to reschedule exams that were scheduled for the day of the climate strike in order to facilitate students' participation. And that was a huge gesture of support that was not curricular, but it was really important. Mr. Fox, the compost maven, actually helped students learn how to use the public bus system in order to get from school to the climate strike. And so that's a little more work, but it was, again, like a non-curricular gesture of support that meant a lot. So I just say all of that just to kind of say that there's a lot of ways to support, and maybe it's just supporting student organizing in the same way that you would support a student who does athletics really rigorously, or it has a really strong passion for music, just, by being accommodating and supportive of whatever students care about outside the classroom.
We have about 4 minutes left, and I just want to ask both of you, a lot's been said and shared tonight. Is there something that hasn't been shared or said that you really want to make sure you give people before we part?
Just want to offer some solidarity and to share that since I started working on this topic, my climate anxiety has gotten a lot better. And it sounds like this is a very engaged group of teachers and interested people here, which is amazing. I hope that each of you has the opportunity to talk to someone else about what you heard tonight, and maybe share with them that, this can be something that can benefit your state of mind as an educator as well.
And I would just say that it was really my educators who, gave me the tools I needed to do climate organizing at any scale. Even though it wasn't talked about in the classroom, it was so many things that weren't directly about climate change, but were about teaching students to be critical thinkers, to feel empowered in the context of their country and their state and their city. Empowering students to do project-based learning and write papers on anything they wanted. And for me, that was climate. And that really made me into the person I am today. So I guess just to say that what educators did was so important for me, and it is so underappreciated, but makes such a difference. And I'm really, really grateful to everyone who showed up today. I even see Professor Photos, who is, my teacher at Yale, and that's so cool that he's here. So still going on today, and really grateful and just thankful that all of you are caring about this issue.
So what do you think? Here we are with 2 minutes to go and a sense of urgency in the chat, in the questions. I detect a wish for strength and solidarity and community and open-mindedness at the same time to different pathways to protecting our planet. What next? Can we come together again? It's been 1 hour and a lot of extraordinary people in this room. What would you like to see happen with this caring group that has gotten its feet more than a bit wet in these issues?
Well, you're planning a series, right?
Yep. And it's going to be a series, by the way. Here's the plan. It's not going to end, right? Because we have to keep this on the front burner. So, yes, and we will save the chat. I understand it's been turned off on the sidebar. But I just want to thank, we have a minute left. I want to thank Naina and Anya so much for being here tonight, for doing what you do, for having done it for years, for seeing it as a path of purpose, And purpose also motivates our children, right? Things don't have to be rosy all the time. It sure helps to move forward with purpose. And thank everyone in the chat. You've been, and in the Q&A, you've been amazing, passionate participants. And I would just love Anya and Naina to have the last word.
I just want to say thanks for the work that you all do. And I put the link in the chat a couple times, but you can keep up with my work. I cover the intersection of education and climate change for the Hechinger Report and for GRIST and in my newsletter. And just be happy to be invited here tonight. Thank you.
Yeah, a lot of gratitude. I am going to put the link in the chat again to Sunrise Summer Camp and also put my email. I have actually written a lot of curriculum on social movements and climate. And if ever anyone wants to, in the spirit of resource sharing, use any of that or adopt it for their classroom, please feel free to reach out and I'd be happy to share.
This is so exciting. I know what you both said was the last word, but I can't leave without thanking you tremendously. You've kicked off our series with a great big bang, and grateful to you both. You've given us a lot of energy. And you can see all the thanks in the chat. So wishing everyone a great night and thank you again.
Take care. Good night.